What would you do if the woman you trusted most shattered your world? When a devoted husband discovers his wife's betrayal, his heartbreak quickly turns to a cold, calculated determination. As secrets unravel and tension rises, he crafts a masterful plan to expose her lies and claim his revenge. This is a story of betrayal, psychological warfare, and unexpected twists, where nothing is as it seems. Can one man turn his pain into power and emerge stronger than ever?
They say you can feel it before you see it, when something precious begins to slip away. For months, I had noticed the small changes in her. My wife, Emma, wasn't the same woman I had married 20 years ago. She used to hum while washing dishes, her voice blending with the clatter of silverware, filling the house with warmth. Now, silence echoed through our evenings, interrupted only by the mechanical sounds of her scrolling through her phone. It wasn't as if we fought, we didn't even argue anymore. We lived in parallel, exchanging pleasantries like strangers in an elevator. The spark that once fueled us had dimmed into a cold, distant light. At first, I blamed work. Her job at the community center had been draining lately. Then, I blamed myself. Maybe I wasn't enough anymore. But the clues began stacking up. She started coming home later than usual, always with vague explanations about staying late to help out. There were new outfits, too nice for our quiet suburban life, and a perfume I didn't recognize. I wanted to believe it was nothing. I told myself I was overthinking, that marriage evolves, and maybe we just drifted into this quiet phase. Then came the conversations. Not with me, of course. Her laughter floated through the walls when she was on the phone. I couldn't remember the last time I'd made her laugh like that. And the way she'd glance at her phone, her lips curling into a smile she didn't share with me, it wasn't nothing. The distance was more than emotional now. She was physically slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to pull her back. But I wasn't blind. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than the mundane excuses she offered. I didn't know it then, but I was already preparing myself for the storm that was about to break. It started as an innocent idea, at least that's how she presented it. Emma wanted to learn French. She claimed it was for personal growth, a hobby to fill her evenings and challenge her mind. She said it with such conviction that I couldn't argue, even though it struck me as odd. She'd never shown an interest in languages before, but maybe this was her way of finding herself again. When the tutor arrived, I shook his hand, doing my best to mask the unease that bubbled beneath the surface. His name was Julian, charming, well-dressed, with an accent that turned even the most mundane phrases into poetry. He radiated charisma, the kind that commanded attention in any room. I told myself he was just here to teach, nothing more. Their lesson started in the living room. At first, I would linger nearby, pretending to read or watch TV. I didn't understand a word they were saying, but I could hear the rhythm of their conversation, light, effortless, filled with laughter. Laughter that used to be ours. Over time, they moved the lessons to the kitchen, then her study. She said it was quieter there, fewer distractions. Each new location felt like another inch of space growing between us. She began to spend more time practicing, jotting down notes in notebooks that I wasn't allowed to see. I told myself this was good for her. After all, everyone needs something to feel passionate about. But there was something about the way she talked about Julian. Her voice softened when she mentioned him, her eyes lit up in a way they hadn't in years. I found myself studying her expressions, looking for signs, wondering if I was imagining things. I wasn't. The day I overheard them talking, their words playful and laced with a familiarity that didn't belong between teacher and student, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. My mind was racing, but I played it cool. I didn't confront her, not yet. I needed to see where this was going, even though every instinct screamed for me to stop it. This wasn't just about French anymore. It was about her. About him. About us. The change wasn't sudden, it crept in, quiet and insidious, like shadows stretching across the walls at dusk. Emma was different now, lighter, more alive. She spent more time in front of the mirror, perfecting a look that seemed too polished for an ordinary day. Her smiles came more easily, though they were rarely directed at me. Her lessons with Julian stretched longer, spilling into evenings that used to be hours. They laughed in a way that filled the house with warmth, yet it chilled me to my core. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just her enthusiasm for learning, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew better. It was the little things that gave them away. The way she spoke about him, not just his teaching methods, but his wit and insight. She started dropping French phrases into our conversations, her eyes sparkling as she shared his favorite idioms. She looked proud, almost smug, as if I should be impressed by their private little world. Then there were the glances. I caught them once, just once, in a moment they didn't think I was watching. Julian's gaze lingered on her a second too long, and she didn't look away. It wasn't just the way she smiled at him, it was the way she didn't smile at me. I told myself to confront her, but every time I tried, the words stuck in my throat. What if I was wrong? What if this was just my own insecurity poisoning what little we had left? I didn't want to be that husband, the one who accuses without proof, who drives a wedge where there's already so much space. But proof was piling up, whether I wanted it to or not. She started canceling our plans. A date night we'd agreed on weeks ago was brushed aside for an important lesson. I could feel myself growing colder, retreating into my own silence as she poured her energy into their connection. The worst part was that she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she didn't care. Whatever this was between them, it was growing. And whatever we had, it was wilting under its weight. It wasn't just in my head anymore. The evidence was there, scattered like breadcrumbs, leading me down a path I didn't want to follow. Emma's sudden obsession with her phone was impossible to ignore. She'd smile at her screen, her fingers moving quickly, only to lock it the moment I walked into the room. I pretended not to notice, but it gnawed at me. One night, I heard her laughing in the kitchen. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years, rich and full, yet it wasn't for me. I leaned against the doorway, just out of sight, and listened. She was on the phone, her voice low and playful, speaking in a mix of French and English. I didn't understand most of it, but I caught one word clearly: Julian. The knot in my stomach tightened. I started paying closer attention, not because I wanted to catch her, but because I needed to understand. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find her sitting in the living room, her laptop open, headphones on. She said it was work. I didn't believe her. Then there were the excuses. She started leaving the house more often, claiming she needed to clear her head or run errands that didn't seem to result in anything tangible. I told myself to trust her, to hold on to the vows we'd made. But trust is fragile, and hers was slipping through my fingers like water. One evening, I followed her. It wasn't planned, I just needed to know where she went when she wasn't home. I trailed her car as she drove across town, my pulse pounding in my ears. When she pulled into a small cafe, I parked a block away and waited. Julian was already there. They sat by the window, their heads close together. I watched as she leaned in, her hand brushing his arm. They weren't just two people sharing a conversation. There was an intimacy between them, a connection I hadn't seen in years. I didn't go inside. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I drove home, my mind racing, my heart shattered. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we got here. I wasn't just losing her, I'd already lost her. The truth is a strange thing. You think you want it, crave it even, but when it stares you in the face, it doesn't set you free. It crushes you. That moment in the cafe was the final nail in the coffin, but the realization didn't hit me all at once. It crept in, piece by piece, tearing me apart from the inside. I couldn't look at her the same way. Every smile, every casual touch, every word she spoke seemed tainted. I wondered how long it had been going on, how many nights I'd sat across from her at dinner, clueless, while she was living a life I wasn't part of. She came home that night with the same air of nonchalance, tossing her purse onto the counter and asking how my day had been. I answered, my voice steady, but my insides churned. How could she act so normal, so untouched by guilt? I wanted to yell, to confront her with what I'd seen, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I started observing more closely, piecing together a puzzle I never wanted to solve. Her schedule, her habits, even the way she carried herself, it all painted a picture I couldn't unsee. The worst part was how little effort she made to hide it. Or maybe she thought I wouldn't notice. The late-night phone calls, the extra-long lessons, the way she would disappear into her thoughts, smiling at something I wasn't privy to. I began to replay moments in my mind, searching for the exact point when she'd stopped being mine. Was it when she hired Julian? Or had it started before, festering in silence while I carried on, blissfully unaware? Realizing the truth wasn't a relief. It was a burden. Every time she left the house, every time her phone buzzed, I felt the betrayal like a fresh wound. But more than anything, I felt powerless. Until I didn't. That was the night I decided I wouldn't let her destroy me. If she was going to live in lies, I would make sure the truth came out. But it wouldn't be on her terms. No, this time, I'd be the one holding the cards. Anger has a way of sharpening your focus, of clearing the haze left by heartbreak. I stopped asking why she did it, stopped mourning the love we used to share. Instead, I turned my attention to the here and now, to the betrayal that had become a cancer in our home. She didn't know that I knew. That was my advantage, and I guarded it fiercely. Every time she left the house, I took note of the time, the destination, the excuses she gave. Every laugh she shared with Julian, every secret glance, I filed it away, building a case not for her, but for me. At night, I lay awake, my mind buzzing with plans. Confronting her outright would be too simple, too clean. I wanted her to feel what I felt, to sit in the suffocating silence of knowing, to see her world unravel the way mine had. My opportunity came sooner than I expected. She left her phone on the counter one evening, a rare oversight. My hands trembled as I picked it up, scrolling through her messages. There they were, texts from Julian, filled with inside jokes, plans, and affection that should have been mine. I felt a mix of rage and vindication. The proof I needed was right there in my hands, but I didn't act on it. Not yet. Instead, I made a copy of everything. Screenshots, timestamps, even the little emojis they used to punctuate their conversations. This wasn't just about catching her. It was about control. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some semblance of power. I began setting the stage for what would come next. I acted normal, even cheerful at times, so she wouldn't suspect a thing. But every word I spoke, every smile I forced, was laced with purpose. I wasn't just her husband anymore, I was her shadow, watching, waiting. I knew it couldn't go on forever. The storm was coming, and when it hit, it wouldn't be subtle. It would tear through everything, leaving no room for pretense. I wasn't just going to expose her betrayal, I was going to make sure she understood the full weight of it. Every plan needs precision, and mine was no different. This wasn't about catching her in a careless moment or having a screaming match that led nowhere. I wanted her to feel the gravity of what she'd done, to see her carefully constructed facade crumble beneath the weight of her own lies. It started with a few small deceptions of my own. I told her I had a business trip coming up, a conference in another state that would keep me away for the weekend. She barely looked up from her phone when I mentioned it, mumbling something about how she'd miss me. The irony wasn't lost on me. That Friday morning, I packed my bag and kissed her goodbye. Her smile was warm, almost relieved, and it took everything in me not to react. I drove away, circling the block a few times before parking a few streets over. From there, I watched. Her schedule was predictable, almost laughably so. Within an hour, Julian's car pulled into our driveway. She opened the door for him, wearing a dress I hadn't seen in years. They embraced briefly before disappearing inside. I waited. Time moved slowly, every second stretching into an eternity, but I was patient. When the moment felt right, I made my move. I slipped into the house through the back door, careful not to make a sound. The voices led me upstairs. I didn't need to see anything to know what was happening, but I wasn't here for proof. I was here for justice. The door to our bedroom was slightly ajar, enough for me to hear their laughter, their whispered exchanges. My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of anger and anticipation. I pushed the door open with a deliberate slowness, savoring the look of shock on their faces as they turned toward me. Julian froze, his confidence evaporating in an instant. Emma's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she scrambled for words that wouldn't come. I didn't yell. I didn't lash out. I simply stood there, letting the weight of my presence speak for itself. "Don't stop on my account," I said finally, my voice calm but laced with venom. The silence was deafening. I turned and walked out, leaving them in the ruins of their moment. They thought that was the end of it. They couldn't have been more wrong. In the days that followed, the house felt like a battlefield after the war, silent, tense, and filled with the weight of unspoken truths. Emma tried to reach me, her apologies weak and fragmented, but I barely listened. Her words meant nothing now. What mattered was what came next. I waited for the right moment to make my move. Timing was everything. Letting her stew in her guilt was part of the plan, but the revelation needed precision. I wanted to shatter the illusion she'd built for herself, to expose her betrayal for what it truly was. The opportunity came on a Sunday afternoon, when we were supposed to have dinner with some friends. She had spent the morning trying to act normal, but her eyes betrayed her. There was fear in them, fear of what I might say, of when the other shoe would drop. When we arrived at the restaurant, I could see her relief. She thought I'd decided to move on, to let it go. That was her first mistake. Halfway through the meal, I casually pulled out my phone. "You know," I said, setting it on the table, "it's funny how technology works these days. It's so easy to capture moments, to save them for later." Her fork paused mid-air, her knuckles white as she gripped it. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. I tapped the screen, and the first message between her and Julian appeared. I slid the phone across the table to her. "This," I said simply. Her face drained of color as she scrolled through the messages, each one a knife to her carefully constructed narrative. The table fell silent, our friends exchanging uneasy glances, unsure of what to say. "You lied to me," I continued, my voice low but steady. "You brought him into our home. Into our bed." She tried to speak, her voice breaking, but I didn't let her. "You destroyed us," I said. "And for what? For this?" Her tears began to fall, but they didn't move me. This wasn't about reconciliation or forgiveness. This was about truth, raw, unfiltered, and undeniable. I stood, leaving her and the phone behind. She called after me, her voice desperate, but I didn't look back. The revelation wasn't just for her. It was for me. For the closure I needed to move forward, even if it meant leaving everything behind. Revenge isn't always about anger. For me, it became about balance, making her understand the weight of what she'd done without lifting a finger in violence. My weapons weren't physical, they were psychological, calculated, and precise. After the dinner incident, I moved out of the house. I told her it was temporary, that I needed space to think, but that was the first lie I'd ever told her. The truth was, I wasn't coming back. Not as the man she knew. While she was busy trying to salvage our marriage, sending me tearful messages and begging for a second chance, I was orchestrating her downfall. I began reaching out to mutual friends, carefully planting seeds of doubt about her character without being too direct. It's been a tough time, I'd say, letting their curiosity fill in the gaps. Her perfect world, the one she'd built on lies, began to crumble. Invitations to social gatherings became less frequent. Friends who used to call regularly now avoided her. I didn't have to say much, people can sense when something is off. But the real coup de grace was yet to come. I filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. That alone shook her, but what came next was the final blow. Julian didn't know it, but I had evidence of his inappropriate relationships with other students. I sent an anonymous tip to his workplace, attaching just enough proof to raise questions. Within weeks, he was gone, his reputation in tatters, his career over. Emma, now isolated and without the man she'd risked everything for, had nothing left but regret. I heard from mutual acquaintances that she was struggling to keep up appearances, her once confident demeanor replaced by uncertainty and shame. I didn't gloat. This wasn't about watching her suffer, it was about ensuring she understood the cost of her betrayal. As for me, I felt something I hadn't in months: peace. Walking away from her wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I deserved better than the life she'd given me. And now, I had the chance to find it. In the weeks and months that followed, I began to rebuild, not just my life, but myself. The scars of betrayal don't fade overnight, but they become a part of you, a map of where you've been and how far you've come. Emma reached out a few times, her messages a mix of apologies and pleas. She wanted to meet, to talk, to explain herself. But I had no interest in her explanations. I had spent too long living in her world of half-truths and deceit. For a while, the house felt hollow without her. The echoes of our past lingered in the quiet corners, the laughter, the arguments, the moments we thought would last forever. But eventually, even those faded. I replaced the old furniture, painted the walls, and created a space that felt like mine. The friends who stood by me became my anchors. Over beers and late-night conversations, they reminded me of who I was before all this, someone who loved deeply, trusted fully, and lived without the shadow of betrayal hanging over him. Slowly, I began to recognize that man again. As for Emma, I heard through the grapevine that her life wasn't what she'd imagined. Julian had disappeared, leaving her to face the fallout alone. She moved to a smaller apartment, started a new job, and kept a low profile. I felt no joy in her struggles, only a quiet sense of justice. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't just break you, it remakes you. I became someone stronger, someone who understood the value of trust and the cost of giving it to the wrong person. I didn't become bitter, I became wiser. Now, when I look back, I see the lessons more than the pain. I see a man who survived, who stood tall in the face of heartbreak and found his way back to himself. And for that, I'm grateful. The storm had passed, and in its wake, I found peace.
Keep watching our stories by clicking on one of the videos that appear on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be alerted about new videos. See you next time.